Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few moments, but I'd like to wait for a few more participants to flow into the platform. I am Scott Davis, Senior Vice President of Industry Engagement for ERIS, and I'll be moderating today's session. Today, we'll be discussing the critical environmental due diligence considerations for commercial real estate when the presence of PFAS is found on the property. We are truly fortunate to have a stellar group of panelists join us today. I'd like to welcome them and give each a very brief introduction, but I encourage you to visit erisinfo.com. The exact link to the page is posted in the chat function here for a fuller profile for each. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that there will be some time dedicated for Q&A after the presentation. Please enter any questions in the QA section of the platform. We prefer you to place the questions there rather than the chat section so we don't miss them. So our panelists today are all active environmental professionals coming together to offer their perspectives from the legal, scientific, and environmental consulting industries. Joining us today are Elizabeth Mack, partner at Lock Lloyd LLP. Elizabeth is a nationally known lawyer with significant experience in brownfield redevelopment, environmental compliance, and environmental litigation. Among other notable recognition, she was recognized as Lawyer of the Year in Environmental Law in the 2022 edition of the Best Lawyers in America. Tara McKnight, PFAS practice leader at Eurofins Environmental Testing USA, has nearly 20 years of experience in the environmental testing industry, specializing in emerging contaminants and pathways of concern with a focus on PFAS and vapor intrusion assessments. John Salmon, professional geologist, assistant director of environmental services and senior principal at Terracon, has been in the environmental consulting industry for over 26 years with areas of expertise in due diligence, site investigation, remediation, and brownfields redevelopment consulting. Dana Wagner, director of environmental due diligence services, senior principal and vice president at Terracon, has 33 years of experience managing thousands of due diligence projects across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, as well as experience in Europe and Asia. Dana specializes in transactions-oriented environmental due diligence, particularly for the financial, legal, and investment sectors. Dana?
Thank you, Scott. Great to be here. A little bit about the discussion today. The panel discussion is going to be focused on due diligence, which of course is governed by the ASTM standard. And we do want to acknowledge that as to today, the standard treats PFAS as a non-scope item. And the fact that EPA has published a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. The 60-day comment period for the proposed rule began on September 6th, and the EPA has stated a goal of finalizing the rule by 2023. However, it is the position of this panel that PFAS does need to be addressed and to be mindful of state-specific requirements. And with that, there are a few key understandings. Number one, the fact that within the standard, once it is listed, it will be considered in the REC determination. Very important for consultants and users to know that, right? That is coming, it's going to be down the road, and we have to be prepared for it. Some of the interesting aspects relative to the adoption of AEI, in AEI, the new standard is that the standard was withdrawn due to negative comments, including those by the Chamber of Commerce, which were concerned about this idea of adding potential CERCLA liability prematurely before it's actually listed as a hazardous substance. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the thought process out there in the regulated community. From a standpoint of the essentially applying PFAS into your scope of work, as noted. Not required, but important to do so. And that really starts with that client awareness. And you'll have clients who are on a spectrum of, yeah, we want to include it every single time we understand what it is, to, yeah, we've heard of it. Should we be concerned? To those on the other end of the spectrum who are saying, we don't know a lot about it, and frankly, we want to see what happens with PFAS being applied in a regulatory setting before we take action. So again, it's important for us to make sure that clients are aware of the issue that it is, and recognizing, again, the idea that it is going to be coming down the road. A real quick note on the regulatory framework that also comes into play very importantly, in that it seriously is across the board, right? So you have the regulatory guidance from a federal perspective, and then from there you go down to states which have very specific and fairly stringent requirements. New York comes to mind, to Texas, which has just developed initial toxicity standards to be included for sites that are within the risk reduction program, to Mississippi, who they really don't have any regulatory framework at all. So again, it runs the gamut. You have to understand what is going on within your state where the site is located in order to address these items. Relative to the, we recognize that there are clients who wish to address PFAS in every scope, regardless of any other considerations. It's our suggestion that it is possible and to be thoughtful about the approach. And this is, again, what we want to speak to today and what we'll be covering. Scott?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Dana. So John, let's start the discussion with you. What if you find PFAS risk during the phase one? How do you identify it in the report?
That's a great question, Scott. We've been confronted with this a number of times, and because it's not a in-scope consideration, because it's not currently a hazardous substance, what we've chosen to do is the client. And by doing that, we go through, as Dana had mentioned, we can discuss the risks, what those risks are for future of the property, for current use of the property, things of that nature, and whether the client wants us to have that in the discussion. And so what we've done is we've gone back in and we've just amended the proposal to include it as a consideration, as an additional scope consideration, and included a discussion in the report. And we've had other clients that have said, absolutely, I don't want you to talk about that in the report. I want to keep the discussions purely on the phone. And we've done it both ways. I think the bigger issue would be if we include it and we did not inform the client of that, and then we might have an issue going forward, because there may be other things we should have included that we did not, things of that nature. So we get to that point, we have those discussions with the client, and then we make a decision of whether or not we want to investigate for the presence of PFAS.
Okay, Elizabeth, do you move on to a phase two and collect data?
Well, that too is a great question. And there are a lot of considerations from the legal standpoint. And of course, I work with Terracon and other consultants all the time. And so we're constantly thinking about this. And to Dana's point, you also have to think about it with regard to what state you're in, because there are plenty of states that have regulatory frameworks for it now. So you can't even, if there's, an emerging federal framework, if you're in a state where there is a framework, it would be challenging to ignore it, or disappointing if we found it was not touched on. So the considerations that I talk to the clients about are if there's a human health risk, if we can look at it and if somebody at a facility might be drinking PFAS contaminated water, if you might be looking, again, this is due diligence. So if you're looking to buy a property that could be the source of PFAS, and that PFAS could be contaminating offsite water, and that can be a private well or a public water supply, and that can be meaningful. We also look at whether there could be a discharge to surface water from a property. And I'm going to pause here for a second and let you know that in certain jurisdictions where you have to test for PFAS, we have found PFAS where there are no sources of PFAS on site, and we can't identify where it's coming from. So then it becomes a meaningful disposal issue. It becomes a meaningful, we usually use carbon filtration to address it if it's a groundwater discharge issue. So there's that bucket of, is there a human health risk? A second bucket is the transactional risk. So obviously, if you are conducting due diligence and find PFAS, who is going to be in charge of the remediation? If there is required remediation, reporting and addressing it. Again, in some states, Massachusetts is one where, depending on what your groundwater, which groundwater zone you're in, it may be that you can close it out with a risk characterization, but in other states you might have to remediate it, which can be very challenging. That dovetails into the third bucket, which is the regulatory risk, which is conceptually the same risk of who is going to deal with it, how long will it need to be dealt with, are you going to be part of the learning curve for a regulatory agency while they're collecting data. We're finding that is happening across the country where sites are learning curve sites, and nobody wants to be part of the science fair. And then there's also the litigation risk, because again, if you've got human health risk issues, then you could have litigation. So anybody conducting due diligence, they're not buying the property to fund litigation. They're buying the property to hopefully do with it what they want, maybe eventually make money, but getting into litigation is not what anybody wants to do. So we're keeping an eye on the litigation risks, which are quite substantial. And circling back to the human health risk is that with the litigation risk is what we're seeing too, is if there's contamination in a public water supply, depending on where you are, that water supply will look upstream to who could be causing that contamination. And we all know as environmental professionals that it doesn't matter that you just bought the site or just bought the site a few years ago. If it happened to be part of the problem, you will be brought into a lawsuit. There are many of those actually going on in New York State right now. So that's something to be, why we want to make sure that clients don't put their head in the sand too much about PFAS. Anyway, I'll quit. I'll zip it for for a few minutes while we pass the baton to others who need to speak.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. So Taryn, related to that question, what do you test for?
Well, you start with some of the drivers for why you would test that Elizabeth spoke to. And then I think you might bracket that with what will you do with the data once you have it? So kind of working your way backwards. If I have this data, what will I compare it to? What will be actionable about it? And then work your way back from there. So what state are you in? What regulatory framework there is? You have to determine what analyte list you'll look for. So do you just default to some state regulatory target list, or do you limit your analyte list to just those compounds that actually have regulatory thresholds associated with them? And And then if you do look for a more expansive list than those that are regulated, what will you do with that information? What if you get a detection for 6.2 FTS at 100 parts per trillion? What does that mean to you? Is any PFAS bad? Is any PFAS at any detectable level a problem? So I think you have to start with kind of answering those questions for yourself first. What would be actionable about this data before you ever set out to go to the field to collect samples and have them analyzed? And from there, we can craft what to test for.
Taryn, can I ask you a question? Typically, what I recommend and work with that Terracon team on would be suggesting that we, I mean, obviously, if we're in a location like Massachusetts where it's PFOS 6, or in New Jersey where it's only 3 PFOS chemicals, we stick to that. Although there's the PFOS 14. What are you seeing? What are you seeing folks ask for? And are you seeing folks ask for beyond what is regulated, because it might be regulated tomorrow? I mean, or the next day or the next day?
Right. And you have a little bit of an interesting dichotomy between those states that have a handful of compounds that are regulated. They often also have a target analyte list.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, Michigan will have a target list of 31 compounds, but only a handful of those actually have regulatory limits associated with them. So depending on the state, you may be stuck having to look for a longer list than just what's regulated because of that matter alone. And you still have to address what will you do with the data once you have it for all those compounds. I would say in general, the EPA has established target analyte lists through their development of methods over the years, and those have been kind of national standards for folks. So whether it was a list of 18 compounds once upon a time, then 24 compounds, then 28, then that kind of jumped up into the 33 to 36 range. Right now, it's currently sitting at 40 compounds. So you see this just continues to expand every other year or so. And then where does it end? How many compounds do you look for? And what's the risk associated with them? Those are some pretty significant questions to ask. And as you said, it's not just what is a risk driver today, but what may be a risk driver tomorrow. And it's rapidly evolving.
Yeah, I agree, Taryn, and I think that's a great point. The one thing, though, that we always want to remember, of course, is we want to make sure the data is actionable, right? We can't necessarily find ourselves creating our self-imposed limbo, as it were, by having information that we really can't understand or really apply in whatever framework is out there. But you're absolutely right. There's a very fine line, and you really do want to be in tune with what the state is looking for. But as a practice, looking at what is currently regulated and for which they currently offer things like a no action letter or some type of liability assurance would be a good place to start.
Good. Any other comments on that, or? Okay.
Well, we are seeing, you know, a whole lot of hand wringing, and there are a lot of different sources. So, for example, you know, it can be a manufacturing source, it can be a wastewater treatment facility, it can be a landfill, and folks out there may be like me, and we're seeing a lot of landfills getting redeveloped, and those, you know, have become a little alarming in the new age of PFAS. Not that it's really new. I mean, some states have been regulating it in one form or fashion for over a decade, but they're, you know, we really are seeing a lot of different sources, and then literally no source at all, because, you know, I know people are familiar who are tuning in, but it's just ubiquitous. So then when you are forced to test for whatever reason. And again, sometimes it's just because a regulator wants the information just to see what they've got. You often find it. So it becomes very difficult to tie together with what Taryn and Dana were just talking about of where do you stop? How do you rein this in?
So that's a good point, Elizabeth. And I usually bring that into the discussion when I'm consulting clients on this, what to test for. A good starting point is there a known or suspected source of PFAS? And is there any way that we can use that information to tailor the target analyte list accordingly? So if you suspect or know there's a PFAS impact likely from AFFF use, we can really limit that target analyte list to those compounds that are almost guaranteed to be present if there are impacts from AFFF. And it's a pretty short list of compounds. If the impacts are from a specific type of manufacturing process, I mean, there are some known and understood, list of compounds relative to certain processes. It's not a great database of information at this point, so it's not a surefire approach, but where we can do that, that is something to consider.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you just made me think about one problematic situation that I had where the manufacturer there was no component of PFAS within their in their stream, their chemical stream, and PFAS had been found, but then we realized that they had been testing their fire suppression system, and we still aren't 100% sure that's where it's from, because the concentrations were pretty high and pretty deep. But it's an interesting thing because a lot of manufacturers do have fire systems that they need to test, and then you get the AFFF. So it's not just the wire cutters and the textile manufacturers and some of the other more obvious, here are these situations that are intended to keep the community safe, and then it has led to PFAS contamination.
Well, and Elizabeth, to your point, I've got a project site. It's a former military base that had AFFF on site. It was an air base, and they had hangars that had a fire suppression system that they malfunctioned periodically. So they would fill the hangar up with foam and they rinsed it out into the tarmac and then the resulting yard as it flowed off, and then releases resulted from inadvertent releases of AFFF. They weren't even fighting a fire. So even if those systems malfunction, they can actually cause a problem.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting in that, these collateral releases that occur, and relative to AFFF, refineries and others have guidance where they recognize they need this material to suppress fires, right? First and foremost, health and safety on an acute basis, but then have a response action that follows the fire, basically to contain the runoff, prevent it from running into the ground. So that's interesting. The other thing that I think is really curious is that when they did supply the 60-day notice, of course, they're identifying the case to be made for identifying PFOS, PFOA as hazardous substances, and they're listing out the affected industries. And of the 21, of course, they're your typical, right? Airports, landfills, much as you're mentioning, Elizabeth, wastewater treatment, manufacturing facilities, but importantly, car washes. That is, again, something I think that will reach out and touch all of our practices, just because of the fact we use the term ubiquity when we talk about the presence of PFAS in the environment. There's car washes literally in commercial real estate in various places in very large quantities. So those things, again, kind of up the ante from a consideration of the issues you want to wrestle with when you have these types of facilities, which may have been initially innocuous, but now potentially a significant concern. The same thing goes for the application of biosolids on agricultural fields. So there's things here that we really need to be paying attention to when talking to clients about what they need to be doing as far as the assessment goes, and what are those next steps that they need to be and should be taking as far as best practice, or I should say standard practice.
Well, and I know everyone knows who's listening in, but it's still worth commenting on the standards being super low, super conservative, that we're talking about parts per trillion, that Taryn and her team are able to tease those parameters out to very, very, very small numbers. And that, some of those, if you sneeze one day and don't sneeze the next, you might see them, you might not. But it's very, it's super challenging. I don't know, actually, Taryn, from your perspective, I mean, when we had talked earlier points, you've said it's really not that challenging to get down to those low concentrations, but you're being pushed down to even lower concentrations, I think.
It's not challenging from a technical detectability standpoint. In fact, I think there's a press release going out today that we've achieved being able to detect the interim health advisory limits of 4 parts per quadrillion. It's technically achievable. It is not sustainable because of how ubiquitous PFAS are. And managing background sources of contamination in the laboratory. That's really the crux of it all. But I'll point out too, when EPA released their interim health advisory limits, they also published final health advisory limits for some additional compounds like PFBS, and you see several orders of magnitude difference. You've got PFBS at 2,000 parts per trillion, and then you've got PFOA at 4 parts per quadrillion. So, this, with the lack of data and information on the health effects, we just kind of pick what limits exist. For a long time, we used the 70 parts per trillion from the health advisory from the EPA, and we just kind of applied that as some blanket standard to all PFAS. And it's turning out that the health risks are very compound specific. And so that's another challenge with due diligence, is if you test for these compounds, what really demonstrates a risk to human health and what doesn't, without the toxicity values.
Yeah, Taryn, that's a great point. And even further, you were talking about once it gets to the laboratory, actually the physical work in gathering a sample that you're ultimately going to be measuring to that low a detection is extremely challenging. How do you sort out from, frankly, the potential for the field contamination or something else that's been going on in the environment that may be influencing the samples that are collected and submitted. So those are all things that, the lower they make that number, it may be achievable from a laboratory perspective, but you really have to stand back and understand the sanctity of the sampling and what are these findings really telling us about what's going on with what we would consider to be a release to the environment.
Right.
Good. In the interest of time, Dana, let's move on. What if you find something in the phase 2 data?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Scott. So, we've touched on some of these things already, right? So it comes down to an evaluation of the risk. And when you have this data coming in, there's various things that are looked at. Again, noted some of those, what are the levels that we're seeing? And frankly, it's very analogous to, what's done generally in phase 2 work and advising clients. When you have these findings, here's what it means relative to the concentrations, the extent and magnitude, the regulatory framework, and importantly, what is it going to cost to deal with it? But there's a big difference here, and Elizabeth touched on this. We're talking about very low action levels and this ubiquity. It does complicate things, and it really puts you in a situation where you're really needing to separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were, because frankly, there's a lot of chaff out there with the data that you get back on these types of investigations. I don't think I've ever seen a non-detect, frankly. So again, those are important things to consider when you're looking at it. But just as you're framing out a risk evaluation, of course, you always want to start with, the scope, right? The testing that was done, you found something, but were you testing just to identify absence presence, or were you actually attempting to understand the genesis and the extent and magnitude? Typically speaking, with PFAS, we want to make sure that we're collecting water samples, groundwater samples, when that's part of the scope, out of a fixed well. There's reasons for that, right? You're trying to make sure that you're getting the best sample possible because of just the fact that you're dealing with such low detection limits. So fixed points are important, in our opinion. Again, that comes with a conversation with the client and, of course, the target in the context of a deal. You also want to do at least 3, right? So you can get a triangulation, at least some hope of what groundwater flow is, so you can have some more data to account for in your interpretation. Here's where we're seeing it. Okay, is this upgradient? Is this downgradient? That can be very important. Proposed use ultimately is important when you're talking about the data and how you're going to be applying it, and that ultimate risk consideration, which I'll have Elizabeth talk to in a moment here. Importantly, of course, you're wanting to get to with PFAS is this idea, just like anything, but I think in particular with PFAS, is the site a possible source of the impact? Because we recognize that as this does get listed, having a source on the site is a very different consideration than not, in particular because of the levels we're dealing with and the fact of how mobile this is in the environment. You could find yourself, or your client could find themselves tied into a PRP status potentially pretty quickly if the site is a source of these impacts. So you look at that, you want to look at, are there other possible sources nearby, right? If it's not us, who is it? So this idea of understanding is important. And also that RP, who is that RP, right? And we'll talk about that in a moment. Concentrations, are they at or near action levels, or are they well in excess? That's a big deal, or can be a big deal. The media that's affected, soil, groundwater are typically included. Of course, sediments, if you're having this material actually getting into stormwater swales and moving off site. We had a site here in Minneapolis that there's a lot of contamination and a lot of costly issues that resulted in from that very occurrence. And then there's air. And, again, a lot of people, there's a consideration, well, it's not, it's highly soluble. It's not really a vapor concern. Well, it can be in certain environments, and there are certain PFAS compounds which potentially have that, the volatility. So you have to understand that. From a standpoint of The further evaluation, of course, depth of groundwater makes a big difference. If you have an offsite source and groundwater is really deep and it's migrating onto your site, and I'll talk about this real quickly with a couple scenarios, that might be a big meh, right? So it's moving under your site, and as long as you're not interacting with it, that might allow you to move ahead and categorize it as maybe a moderate risk. The magnitude of the likely source area is a big deal, right? If you have a firefighting area that's been used over the years, or a wastewater pond, that's far different than they had a container of, maybe a stain resistant material which happened to spill onto the ground. So those are important aspects, just like anything. Extent, and we'll talk about this too. Is it contained at the site? That's a big deal, of course, if the site is a source. Importantly, a drinking water sources nearby. You always want to talk about receptors. Anytime you're considering risks that are posed by releases at your site, what are the receptors? And in particular with PFAS, it's important to understand, are there drinking water sources nearby? Because that, as also Elizabeth noted, ups the ante a tremendous amount. What are those concerns regarding the third-party actions that would be considered? And then, of course, we talked about this, the regulatory framework and requirement. What is there, right? So is this something where they don't really have anything mature, or is it a state, like New York, Massachusetts, California, where, hey, we've got to take some action because we're identifying some issues here and there's a process to go through. And is there a way to manage the releases in a regulatory setting to get closure? And what about liability assurances? So those things are all taken into account from an evaluation of the risk. And just a couple of quick examples. For instance, if you had, this is a actual situation that we had. So we had a former fire station that was associated with an air base that the client was acquiring the property, and the fire station was there historically. We undertook an investigation, including fixed wells, identifying groundwater flow direction. And this was a state that did not have a regulatory framework, but they basically followed the federal, used the health advisories that the feds had published. So we identified some impact in all of the sampling points, but we had one that was just above the health advisory limit. And based on just the scope of the testing and the fact that we didn't see anything further, we were able to advise the client on a structure of a deal that could allow them to move forward, and they were very comfortable. And this is a very, very large institutional investor. And so it was all a question of understanding what their risk was, and the fact, of course, that the Department of Defense was ultimately viewed as a potentially responsible party should anything further happen with it. So again, those are things that come into play. And as noted, deeper impact to groundwater, it may be that we're not really concerned because we're not going to interact with it. It's from, and again, this is from an offsite migration, and that would be not necessarily an issue.
So Dana,
go ahead, please.
One thing that we haven't talked about, I think, is the fact that this is not just a groundwater issue. It's also a soil issue. So there's atmospheric deposition. There's obviously, if you're a source, if the property is a source, then it can be in soil. Obviously that can leach or mobilize to groundwater. We've been focused very much on the groundwater issue, but one of the reasons why soil can be a problem is not just the obvious reasons of what it can do to groundwater and then all the things that we've been discussing, but one of the things that I'm finding, and your teams may be finding as well, is that any PFAS detections, regardless of source, regardless of concentrations, can can, depending on where you are, flip you into a very costly category if you're trying to dispose of soil. So,
and then-
so it is something else that needs to be considered as, focusing back on the aspect of due diligence. And one of the reasons why, I don't mean that I run around and tell everybody they need to test for PFAS. Believe me, if I can avoid it, I do. But putting our head in the sand can actually get folks like all of us in trouble, because there can be some very expensive repercussions if it's going to be a large excavation and disposal facility says, where's your PFAS data? Et cetera, et cetera. So it just depends on where you are, again, whether that's going to be requested. But ignoring PFAS at this point can be, ignoring that there could be PFAS on your property. I mean, if there is a reason, just like any other due diligence consideration, if you don't think you're going to have chlorinated solvents, you don't need to test for chlorinated solvents. But if you think your site can be, a source, there's just a lot of reasons why that could be a thing. So.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, Elizabeth. And actually, the example I gave in Minneapolis, that was a deposition issue, right, from a plating shop, and it did end up in the stormwater swale from that deposition, and then was conveyed via stormwater. So there are lots of things that need to be considered with regards to this particular contaminant. And soil should always be part of the suite of analytes. There's no question about it. You want to try to rule that out and understand what's going on at the site. And that's I think just a good practice in doing that type of assessment. But yeah.
Taryn, what's all being done in enhancing the science on this?
The whole kit and caboodle, you mean?
No, we only have a couple of minutes, but you're in the hot seat. Tell us what
There's a tremendous amount of investment being made in addressing PFAS now, right? I mean, like just a few points dollar value wise. You've got the infrastructure bill that's allocated $10 billion just to remediating drinking water. You've got this year's annual spending bill for Department of Defense included over $400 million just for investigating PFAS, not even doing anything about it yet. I think the annual estimate of investment in remedial technologies is $3 billion a year. So a tremendous amount of investment, and it also spans to investing in research, understanding fate and transport, exposure pathways, the health risks and toxicity values. So it's really starting to pick up momentum now as well. It's moving at such a rapid pace that we have to stay abreast of those latest developments in the state of the science, or at least partner with people who make it their job to stay abreast of the state of the science. So, but that's the good news, that it's evolving. But the downside is that there's a lot of catching up to do. The policy is really kind of moving out in front of the science, and we've got to close that gap, because otherwise, in particular, when we're doing these due diligence efforts, there's just too much gray area on really understanding what our risk is in front of us.
This is all great. Like, we're nearing the end of the discussion, so I want to spend a little rest of the time addressing what is actionable all about this. I would like to have each of the panel kind of weigh in on it. So panelists, what are your thoughts on how you would address whether the contamination is contained, if there are sensitive receptors, and is the risk manageable? So Dana, let's start with you, followed by John, Elizabeth, and then Darren.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Well, we've touched on a lot of these through the course of our discussion today. So the containment, right? That's an important aspect. Is it something that can be considered to be localized? And we all like those words, right? It's localized and it's manageable. And we have to take into account the fact that, as noted, remedial technology is really, in particular the groundwater, is not, it's really very limited at this point. Now they're coming up, and I think to Terrence's point, there's going to be much more study, and there is much more study and investment on finding technologies that can work. But ultimately, you know, the containment piece is really big, and that's frankly one of the technologies that's applied to control this from a standpoint of its migration. The sensitive receptors, if you do have something where there are sensitive receptors, it just really does up the ante. And if you're moving forward on a site where receptors have been identified and your site's a source, that's going to be a very long discussion, I think, with Elizabeth and your council team about here's what that means and where it's going to bring you. Now, again, it all comes down to the business deal. They're in the business. That's what they do. They take business risks. But we need to advise them on what this means from a regulatory perspective, and what is that long-term picture for them to be able to navigate this site. But that's a tough one. If you have receptors and you have a source on your site that's significant, it does become quite difficult.
John?
Yeah, I think experience I've had is, particularly when you're talking with regulators, it's their first concern is there any kind of drinking water supply, whether it's public or a private well, and is there potential impact there? Because they want to make sure they address that quickly and that they're not having people drink that water. Some states, it's mostly surface water for drinking water. Texas is a good example of that. And there's other states like Florida where almost really, I think all of their drinking water is coming from aquifers. So they have a much bigger risk and concern over those receptors as a result of that, because it gets in the groundwater and migrates far relatively easily. I think the other thing we've certainly seen is that it can migrate pretty far because it doesn't really break down as quickly. And so the containment issue is a difficult one. And then had a project site meeting for my military base or former military base last week, and they did a comparison. They were just finished a PFAS report using the rules prior to EPA's promulgated proposal, and they looked at it post proposal if those were to be enacted, and it drastically changed the picture. And so there's some concern there as things move and they migrate, and in terms of the regulatory landscape, how do I address this? How do I deal with this? It's tough right now. And the states are going to go back and looking at, there's more and more toxicity data coming out. They're going to go and do recalculations. So there's going to be a lot of changes coming as a result of all of this.
Okay. Elizabeth?
Well, I don't have much more to add to what Dana and John have already discussed, because the sensitive receptors that contained on site, the are you a source, are kind of, the main questions. But I'm going to suggest two other issues that don't really go to this, just so that we can tap our audience. But something that those who would be negotiating representations and warranties and transactions, and again, that's part of what may happen during due diligence or as a result of due diligence, is that as a seller of land, that you're sitting there hoping to get rid of, whether or not of PFAS, or whether or not your buyer is thinking about PFAS as part of their due diligence, is that you want to avoid making, if you're the owner of a property today, tomorrow, the next day, you want to avoid making representations about environmental compliance and with laws and whether hazardous substances have been released. You may think that, you know, the property is nothing, but there is a whole new realm of what's a hazardous substance, either under state law or soon to be coming down the pipe under federal law. So if you are part of the counseling team, be very much keep those things in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is if you are, could be, you know, again, sensitive receptors aside, maybe you've done some testing, maybe you haven't, but there are regulators now knocking on doors. And it's to learn do when they learn it, but be aware for your clients and for yourselves that just because you may have put your head in the sand on something, it doesn't mean that it won't come up. It could come up at the next transaction. It could come up because you get a knock on the door.
Okay, Taryn, you want to kind of follow up with that? Then
Oh,
we'll get on to questions.
I'll just leave a closing thought with the conclusions you draw about whether the contamination is contained or your confidence in that is directly dependent upon the PFAS that you tested for. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a lot of questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can before time is up. So let me go ahead and start with the first one. Okay. Until the EPA completes their ruling on whether PFOS is a hazardous material or not, why wouldn't you identify PFOS issues, if present, under the definition of 3.2.11 business environmental risk as identified in ASTM E1527-13?
Well, I'm gonna jump into that, even though I'm not writing the phase one, and I'm gonna say that I think you should. And I want my environmental professionals to do that if they think there is a risk of PFAS. And I think that Dana and John would tell you that they would too. It's just that some clients don't want that reported, but absolutely. And I would be, if it were a site that's a risk, I think it needs to be teased out.
Okay. Next question, PFAS has been found in groundwater, snow, penguins, earthworms, clothing, etc. What is an actionable level of PFAS, or what if it has already been identified in the water supply? Example, Cape Fear River.
Well, if it's been identified in the water supply, you do have some health values associated with PFAS in drinking water. PFAS in other matrices like products has yet to been established. We haven't established what the health risks are of PFAS in our food contact materials, for example.
Right. And so, you know, you know, there is a level, not, you know, I don't want to say that it's safe, but that doesn't cause a public water supply to shut down. There are some concentrations identified in lots of different public water supplies.
Okay. Okay, you made mention of identifying PFAS on a site with no identification of a source. Given the small particle size, has there been any studies conducted that could conclude that PFAS is passed along within the evapotranspiration process and being deposited back to Earth's surface through rainwater?
I think that is what we're thinking of as background conditions of atmospheric deposition. So I think that that has and continues to be studied.
Yep,
I
agreed.
believe
The
if you
background
go to-
is always concerning.
Yeah, if you look at the Cape Fear River with that particular case, it was an aerial deposition from the plant itself that was causing a lot of the problem.
Okay. What's the status of the ability to get insurance within the context of a transaction to cover PFAS? Anybody know that?
I do. So it depends on whether you could be a source site. So if there's a risk that you're a source site, there's no chance. There's a lot more PFAS exclusions, what we call endorsements to exclude, than there used to be. But if you have any kind of manufacturing, historical landfill, all of the suspect uses, chances are you will not get coverage. But it's not a foregone conclusion that it's no coverage. It's just like every issue, including vapor and everything that's come before it, that the underwriters have gotten smarter.
Yeah. Hey, Elizabeth, I had a follow-up question on that. That's also inclusive of rep and warranty insurance where those endorsements are being made.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thoughts on using attorney-client privilege to gain knowledge during due diligence of a fuller list of PFAS?
Well, so that is a super great question. So data in general is really not covered by the attorney-client privilege. We play around with it like it is, but in general, if somebody wants to get your data, they are entitled to get your data. Data is not privileged. It's your communications with your client. So you can wrap it up in terms of you get data and talk to your client about it, but whether anything ultimately will be privileged if there is a demand for it in the right setting, it's unlikely to be protected.
Okay.
But if the attorney is the one that acquires the data and then just communicates about the data to their client, is that privileged?
It's typically not privileged,
Okay.
because you're acquiring it for somebody else. So
Okay.
it's data. So again, data is typically not privileged. It's the thought processes of the attorney and the communications that the attorney and the client had versus the actual data facts. Facts are not privileged.
Okay. To what extent should we be concerned with drinking water taps casually? Is this something we are likely consuming on a daily basis?
Well, I just recently read that it's believed that 95% of all Texans have PFAS in their bloodstream, notwithstanding what anyone feels about any given Texan. I am one. That's still an alarming number, but it's because of Teflon. It's because of Starbucks. No offense to Starbucks, but coffee cups. It's because, of all sorts of, it's the ubiquity of it in everything that we do. I think we're in it.
Yeah, I was in Texas last week for that meeting, and the city of Dallas had noted they had tested all of their drinking water, and they were not finding PFAS above drinking water levels in any of their sources. So there's testing that's being done on a regular basis through UCMR. I think UCMR 5 is what's just now starting. It will expand the list of PFAS. It will expand the communities that get tested down to a smaller population levels. So we'll get much better data. Generally speaking, there's not that many out there. There are some for sure, but there are not that many out there that have major impacts like to be scared of as of yet.
Yeah, I would echo that. With UCMR 5, we expect to get a lot more data and probably see a greater frequency of detection than we did in UCMR 3 because it's an expanded list, lower reporting limits, and more public water systems. However, the states that have conducted statewide drinking water surveys, time and time again, have found very little, if any, impacts to public water supplies in their states. So
There's some local systems that are impacted though. Woburn, Massachusetts is a perfect example. And they sent around letters to every resident, every user.
Yeah, I mean, they exist, just broadly speaking. It's not maybe as impacted as one might think when we talk about how ubiquitous PFAS are and the uses of PFAS, how widespread they are.
Yeah,
Unfortunately,
oh, I'm
go
sorry,
ahead,
Scott,
Dana.
I was
I'll
just-
let you finish. Go ahead and make your
Yeah,
point.
well, no, I was just gonna say, Karen, the difference being between detection and reportability and action level, right? Those three that work together. And I do think there are a fair amount of detections out there. It's a question of whether or not they're exceeding any kind of advisory is really the issue, right?
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, Scott.
No, that's all right. No, unfortunately, we're out of time. I mean, it went by fast. Great job. Thank you, guys. And but we will try to go through the rest of the questions if we can. So to read more about PFAS and its evolving story, please visit ERIS Info Hub on erisinfo.com, which contains many curated articles on PFAS. Link is in the chat. Once there, use the filter tag PFAS. Also, to stay on current and other due diligence topics, bookmark Info Hub and subscribe to our podcast located there. Please note this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the ERIS website in the next few days. On behalf of ERIS and our audience community, I'd like to give a big thank you to our panelists for the knowledge and experience they shared with us today. And to our audience, we want to thank you for your time during this past hour. We look forward to hosting you at our next ERIS webinar, ERIS New Report Authoring Platform, SCREVA, on Thursday, November 10th, 9 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern. Registration is free and the link is in the chat box or can be found on the ERIS website, Info Hub tab on the webinars page. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, guys. Nice
Thank
seeing
you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.